can't wait to hear your thoughts on our next conversation. We've been talking just a bit about it, and it just came up in the last few moments in a call with Stuart about this BBC documentary, supposedly about Gaza, effectively narrated by a young child who turns out to be the son of a Hamas official, a Hamas government minister. There's no way in the world that the people doing the filming of that wouldn't have known this about the child. Huge issues with the video in terms of the propaganda position it takes, but also, I mean, frankly, just things like the child apparently wearing 3 different pairs of shoes and having different haircuts and apparently the same day would suggest that something was a bit wrong with this video. You think some BBC editor might have noticed. Well, other people did notice. They called them up on it. Brilliant work from a journalist David Collier. But it took quite a while to persuade the BBC to take the video down. Now, though, Gary Lineker, Anita Rani, Miriam Margolyes, the likes of director Ken Loach and Mike Lee, and all the other usual suspects of the basically, you know, virtue signalling woke lovies. They're among 650 media figures who've criticised the BBC and called this censorship. Well, let's talk about this with Donnachadh McCarthy, who's a political commentator. Good morning, Donnachadh.
Good morning, Julia. How are you?
Hi. Well, I'm very well. I'm very pleased that it was something that claimed to be reporting has been taken down because it's actually propaganda from Hamas. Why do you think that Gary Lineker and these lovies are all right?
Well, I think hopefully the BBC is just checking the veracity of what the programme's about, and it will be.
Shouldn't they do that before they put it out?
Well, when you ever do a 9-month documentary in a war zone, it is not surprising that some issues may arise. I actually think the major issue here, of course, is censorship. I don't understand why British media and British government allows the one side of a conflict to have access to our media and the other side not. As an Irish person, we have great empathy when we see places like the Warsaw Ghetto being devastated, the Ukraine being devastated, and when we see the scenes in Gaza, it breaks our heart because it reminds us of what we went through. My father was 16 years old, Julia, when the British gunboats arrived up the rivers in Cork and Dublin, flattened our cities. And so we have huge compassion when we see such devastation. We think both sides of the conflict should have access to our media. Otherwise, it's censorship and it's free speech.
I mean, the thing is, when you say both sides, I've seen numerous interviews with people representing the Palestinian civilians over the last year and a half plus since we've had the October 7th massacre. We hear from the Israelis, obviously, because we've got an Israeli government. We've got spokespeople, we've got IDF and others and government ministers. Yes. But very difficult to... Donnachadh, wait. Very difficult for people to hear from what Hamas have to say, other than when they, of course, stage a hostage return and put their banners up and make their statements, because they are, of course, a prescribed terrorist organisation.
And then that's the point I'm trying to make. I actually think Hamas is the government of Gaza. They were originally elected by the people. Gaza.
2005.
Whatever your views on the government of Gaza, and I don't approve of any religious-dominated government, whether it's a Zionist regime in Tel Aviv or the Hamas.
So what do you mean a Zionist regime in Tel Aviv?
Well, I mean the terrorist organisation that has actually killed thousands of people over the last year, innocent children, thousands of kids.
So you're calling the democratically elected Israeli government a Zionist machine and terrorist organisation?
Just as I would call the Hamas regime in
You think there's no moral difference between Hamas and what they do and the Israeli government?
They are both. There is a moral difference between the two. One is an occupied people.
So the Israeli government's worse than Hamas.
The other is a colonial regime.
Colonial regime.
Before Britain's empire, it was the Balfour Declaration, Julia, the population of Palestine was 8% Jewish. After the imperial government gave the go-ahead, the population started having a huge influx from Europe. And what we need to do is to find a way to peacefully manage that legacy.
If only you could think of a reason why a lot of Jewish people from Europe went to Israel. It's so difficult. I haven't read any history books, Donna. I just simply can't think what the reason was. You are aware also that Jews were expelled from every Arab state as well.
I'm not denying that there was problems in Europe, but what I am asking you, Julia, is for compassion for the people who are paying the price. There was I've
got lots of compassion for the people who are paying the price. It's the Israeli innocent civilians and the Palestinian innocent civilians. Here's the trouble. Here's the trouble, Donnachadh. Here's the trouble. the Israeli government, for all its faults, and it has many faults I don't like, certainly the right-wingers in that government I've got no time for whatsoever. However, it's a democratically elected coalition government, okay?
Democratically elected government of a part of the population of Palestine.
No.
Just like we had in
Hamas is not a democratically elected government. It
was.
Well, I don't know. How long does the democratic mandate last for?
How do you have
years.
elections when there's constant
war?
war?
I'm sorry. Israel hasn't been in the Gaza since 2005 until after October the 7th. There are plenty of time for elections, my love. They didn't have any.
Julia?
What?
What is Gaza? What is Gaza?
Okay.
Gaza is 2 million people evicted from their homes by the Nakba, by the Zionist regime, and curled into a tiny sliver of land, and it's no wonder there's violence coming out of it. We've got to sort out the political.
Okay, that's rather okay. Is that not completely irrelevant to the question I asked you about the BBC and Gary Lineker and those?
Freedom. The debate we're having, Julia, is I believe both sides of the conflict should have access to British media. You seem to think only one side should have it.
It's every single bit of footage that we've had out of Gaza since October the 7th has been provided and censored and agreed to by Hamas, because no other footage comes out. The Israelis didn't allow any international media in. And you know why they didn't do that? Because they know how much control Hamas has over everything that happens there. They also know they would have been likely taken hostage. You just create more hostages and more problems. Now, there's very simple reason for that.
There is propaganda from both sides. There is the Hamas propaganda.
There's a war on. There's always propaganda. Hamas has won the propaganda war with useful idiots like yourself. And I use the term useful idiot advisedly, not as an insult to you, but people who just take what they say. Here's the thing. Should the BBC...
Julia, come on, I thought we were better than that. We've got a good relationship.
No, I'm not. I'm saying, I'm using, you know the term useful idiot. Useful idiot to the Soviet Union of China.
Have a respectful conversation.
No, I'm not saying... No, I'm not saying, I'm not using the term. You know exactly what that term means, and it has specific meaning. People who just suck out the teat of the mad propaganda from our enemies, which is what you and Gary Lineker and others have done.
No, not our enemy. I don't see Hamas as our enemies. I don't see the government as our enemies. I see them as involved in a conflict in a country that is far away from Britain, and we should allow both sides to be heard.
Donnachadh, the point is, this wasn't billed as if you don't think Hamas... I hate to tell you, Hamas would kill you as soon as look at you.
Of course, I don't approve of them.
But they're not our enemy.
The Zionist government either.
Yeah, I hate to tell you, you'd count as the infidel, my lovely. You wouldn't be. You'd be on the death list, right? Okay. So, are you going to convert? Are you going to convert to Islamofascism under the Hamas regime, or are you taking death? Which is it?
Because I want freedom of speech doesn't mean I agree with either side of the expression.
Donnachadh, you know I defend freedom of speech. The point is, this document.
You're opposing it.
This documentary was not purporting to be here's Hamas's view, here's a Hamas official's son, here's a propaganda video, this is what they want to put out, and it was purporting to be a BBC documentary about the reality of life for innocent Palestinian children. And when the key child involved in hosting this propaganda video is the child of a Hamas government minister.
Of an agricultural minister. The child of an agricultural minister who is a civil servant, and the Zionist body said that child should not have a voice. Why should not a 14-year-old son of a civil servant, agricultural minister, not have a voice in British...
Okay, question to you, Donnachadh. Donnachadh, question. Donnachadh, you said that point. You don't need to keep saying it. If it was the voice of this son of a Hamas minister, okay, why didn't the BBC flag that up?
Well, actually, they are actually. I agree, it should have been done. And what
why didn't they?
The reviewing.
Why didn't they?
What they will do.
No, Donnachadh, answer one of the questions I've asked you. Why didn't they?
The spokesperson today said that they are reviewing the programme, and hopefully they will put up the programme with the information that you rightly say should be.
Why didn't they put it in the first place? Either they didn't know, which was a breach of basic editorial control, or they knew and they didn't mention
it. A breach of editorial knowledge. You know, I've written, as a journalist for The Independent, I wrote columns, I wrote articles. It may have happened that when I was writing, I did not know a piece of information. Thankfully, during my years of writing, I had never had to be corrected. But I am human. Journalists are human, and that's what happened in this case. On the BBC should put it right. I think both of us agree. It should be the information should be included, but the program should be broadcast.
Okay, but only as here's some Hamas propaganda for you. The continuity issues alone. Any editor worth their salt with more than 10 minutes experience would have looked at the continuity problems. A child who apparently on the same day had hair that was long and then short, wore 3 different pairs of shoes, trainers, Crocs, and flip-flops in apparently the same day, changed outfits.
And you're talking about shoes, Julia. Come on.
Donnachadh,
you're better than this.
Donnachadh, you're not listening to my point. When the document...
You're talking about shoes.
Yes,
you're talking about haircuts.
Yes, because there were flags, there were blatant red flags that showed that this documentary was not what it purported to be.
Slaughtered.
Oh, yes, of course you are. Slaughtered how?
By bombs, by 2,000-pound bombs, indiscriminately dropped on civilians against all human international rights.
Even based on Hamas's own figures on the number of deaths there have been, it is quite clear that the number of civilian deaths per fighters' deaths is about 1-to-1. Do you know of any other country in any war that has ever achieved such a low civilian death count per soldier?
Thankfully, the International Court of Justice, thankfully Amnesty International, thankfully the international community agrees that there was a horrific human rights crimes carried out in Gaza.
That's not what they said. That is not what... that's not what they said. Donnachadh, you know, if you were writing an article about this, there'd be a correction, because that's not what they said.
Well, if you actually look at the film footage that your studio is quite rightly showing, the background of that child, we constantly see the flattened buildings. Almost every building...
Why on earth would those buildings be flattened?
Because they actually indiscriminately dropped...
No, that's not indiscriminate. No, they bombed buildings where Hamas fighters were hiding.
Every single thing in Gaza, Julia. Please, look at it.
Donnachadh, the only person, the only people responsible for what's happened to Gaza and what's happened to that child is Hamas, the prescribed terrorist organisation that you think is...
The apartheid regime in Israel needs
to... It's not an apartheid regime. Arabs vote in elections in Israel just as much.
It is an apartheid regime. And what are we going to do?
Donnachadh, my love, I'm going to end this now, partly because of time and partly because, all due respect, you're talking such abject, ignorant, uninformed, factually incorrect nonsense. You may as well work at the BBC doing news reporting on Gaza.